Good morning to everyone here at the Beverly Hilton and those watching online, and welcome to the 2024 Milken Institute Global Conference. Over the next 3 days, we've assembled over 1,000 speakers to lend their voices to wide-ranging discussions across finance, health, philanthropy, and geopolitical landscapes, not to just highlight the challenges we all see, but to share their collective insights toward crafting workable solutions. The problems we'll discuss are complex, multifaceted, and difficult to solve. But that only makes our participation in addressing them even more critical. And those of us drawn to this event have both the capacity and capabilities to do just that. As we conduct our conferences around the world, I often see people who want to help, but then think, I'm just one person, what could I do? But could is a word imbued with possibility and promise. And you all have the talents and networks to help. That's why we selected Shaping a Shared Future as this year's theme. You are all active architects in determining the future you want to see, and despite all the differences which separate us, we are going to have to find a way to seek common ground and tackle these challenges together. Our aim through the more than 200 sessions we've curated is to show the complexities we face in the world today present both challenges and opportunities at the same time. Here are a few examples of what we'll be talking about. We no sooner exited from pandemic-related supply chain disruptions when two of the world's busiest trade routes tumbled into disarray: the Suez Canal due to armed conflict and the Panama Canal due to drought. Depression is one of the top causes of disability in the United States today, against the backdrop of the ongoing stigma people have about even talking about mental health issues. We're battling online misinformation, and cybercrime is expected to reach $10 trillion, while at the same time, 2.6 billion people, nearly a third of the world's population, still have no internet access at all. And more than 110 million people around the world have been displaced due to conflict, the highest level in human history. As I've traveled around the world since last year's conference, I've seen these gaps and many others creating deficits of all sorts. Countries run fiscal deficits, there are significant health and nutrition deficits in all corners. But what I see most often is a deficit of hope. Young people in particular have lost faith in the idea that their lives will be better than their parents or grandparents, and that manifests itself in various ways. So while we've conquered COVID and are making enormous strides against cancer and other diseases, 112,000 Americans died of fentanyl overdose last year. It is the #1 killer of young adults in the United States. And even more disturbing, the #1 killer of US children is now gun violence. There were 656 mass shootings recorded in the United States last year. At the same time, there is much good going on in the world, and we'll be highlighting those successes too. New innovations in green technologies are creating sustainable off-grid strategies, and we'll be awarding the annual $1 million Milken Motsepe Prize later this morning to the winning team addressing this need in Africa. Advances in fintech are banking millions of previously unbanked people for the first time and democratizing access to capital and entrepreneurship along the way. Nearly $500 billion in philanthropic capital funded countless initiatives around the globe last year. The scale of that means every couple of years, $2 trillion is devoted to charitable causes. So while acrimony may get more of the headlines, extraordinary generosity is also unfolding, even if it's not getting the same attention. So as you navigate your way through this conference and all its speakers and sessions and crowded hallways over the next few days, I would ask that you think of ways to amplify the threads of hope and positivity you encounter. Task yourself with gaining a deeper understanding of how these issues can be broken down into manageable components and what role you, your company, or your connections can play in solving them. Meet 5 people you might otherwise never encounter and ask them, what have they learned? What do they worry about? What could you do to help? All of us in this room have been blessed with abundance in many flavors. Let's see how we can be the catalyst of change for those who haven't. And on behalf of the entire Milken Institute, thank you for joining us and enjoy Global Conference 2024.
To open the session on the state of the global financial system, please welcome to the stage IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva in conversation with Editor-in-Chief of The Economist, Zanny Minton-Beddoes.
Good morning, Kristalina. Gosh, it's like Hollywood here. Well, I guess we are in Hollywood. I am delighted to be moderating this conversation with you. I thought we'd set the stage for the rest of your conversations with a kind of quick tour of the world and how badly or how well things are going. And I wanted to start, I mean, the IMF, you all know this, but the IMF is the world's premier financial firefighter. When things go bad, you come in. Mm-hmm. And you have just, I must tell everyone who doesn't know this, you've just been appointed to a second term. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So Kristalina began this job in 2019, and if you finish your second term, which I'm sure you will be there until 2029. So the entire decade of the 2020s will be, any crises will be sorted out by Kristalina. So let's start with what keeps you up at night, because the World Economic Outlook, which is your biannual flagship publication of forecasts, I read and it's pretty upbeat. I mean, you say that the world economy has been remarkably resilient in the face of shocks. You're expecting 3.2% growth, that's not bad, and slowly declining inflation. So I kind of read this and thought, what I want to start with asking Kristalina is what keeps her up? What's going to go wrong?
Another shock that could derail the direction of the economy. Just imagine that something distorts energy prices, pushes them up, then this
Middle East?
Beautiful trend of inflation going down and growth in positive territory can be disturbed. So the most important thing is for everybody to be cool, composed, and careful.
Cool, composed, and careful. That's pretty good advice generally, I think. Let's turn then to the US, where I know many people here are focusing their attention. I mean, the US economy has been one of the big reasons the world economy has been so remarkably resilient. I mean, it's like the Energizer Bunny, this economy. It's just extraordinary. But inflation has proved now to be pretty stubborn. So I guess, can the Fed pull it off, that it gets inflation down without further rate hikes, or do you think we're going to have to see that here?
Look, to everybody in this room, there is a reason to be happy about the US performance. The US is very innovative as economy. Ideas turn into businesses and then businesses get scaled up. The US has a remarkably strong labor market, and an issue that is politically controversial from an economic standpoint is proven to be good for the economy, the fact that there is ample supply of labor. And the US has the tremendous advantage of being an energy exporter at a time when artificial intelligence demands a lot of energy. And we know that other economies are limping because they're dependent on energy import. So all these things go for the US. And of course, the question is, would the inflation drive down be completed? We think that it will be completed this year. We look at the data. What we see is that some data is a bit more worrying. Other data says, yeah, it's going to happen. We just saw the hiring data. And let's remember, this disinflation is not just in the hands of the Fed. It is also in the hands of American businesses. Repairing the supply chains played a role in bringing inflation down. Could that be derailed? We just talked about it. It could. But as you know, we say in our baseline scenario, we would see inflation going down to target this year and the Fed starting to cut.
That's very clear. One element of the US that certainly perplexes me is the size of the fiscal deficit. I mean, when I was at the IMF 100 years ago, we used to get worried about deficits bigger than 3% of GDP. Now it's, 7% the US fiscal deficit? And if you look further out, there's no sign either of the policies in place or anything that would bring it substantially down. So I know that the fund has written about this, you've warned about it, but how urgent is it that the US deals with its fiscal?
I mean, let's look at the numbers. In 2015, when interest rates were very low, the service of the debt of the and that was lower, service of the debt of the United States was under 7% of federal revenues. Today, it is over 17%. It's pricey. And when we look at the justification to continue with more generous spending, hard to come with. One, the US is very attractive to financial flows. In fact, we see financial flows into the US reaching 1/3 of the money that moves in the world. It was only 18% before the pandemic. So it is not like there is shortage of investments in the US economy. And second, when we are assessing the viability of continuing with a fiscal policy like this, and we ask a question, could there be course correction? The answer is yes, there could be. When we look at the revenue-raising side, there are plenty of loopholes and tax exemptions that are not growth-enhancing. When we look at the spending side, the US has some entitlement policies that need to be addressed. Look, when you are a youthful country with a growing population, you can be generous. When you are an aging country, then you need to be very careful how much and for what you spend.
And you're putting the US in the latter category, just to be clear.
Well, yes, it is. I mean, luckily for the US, it is such an attractive place for people to come to work that
but that's what's so striking.
The world is helping the US with its demography.
Well, that's true. So that may help the fiscal situation, that if you carry on having large-scale immigration. But just, I'm going to push you a little bit more on this because it really is, it's an extraordinary figure, 7% of GDP. And I think debt interest payments are now higher than defense spending. So there is a question of, you're right, the rest of the world is very happy to fund this for the moment, but isn't it a macro risk for the rest of the world if the US doesn't get its fiscal under control?
It cannot go like this forever because the very burden on the US is going to cripple spending that is necessary to make for servicing the debt. To pay 17+% in debt service is just mind-boggling. And also, we know that if the US needs to continue to fund itself by borrowing, there is opportunity cost of this money when it comes to the US to finance servicing the debt. It doesn't go to emerging markets where it can finance jobs and business opportunities for American companies.
And will it be, I mean, the IMF comes into countries that have fiscal crises the whole time. Will this be a slow-burning crisis, or is there a risk that even the US suddenly loses investment?
I mean, the US has the exuberant privilege of the dollar. So it is not something that should let people in this room to lose sleep tonight.
Oh, good.
But it is just not healthy for the economy long term. And when the US faces problems because of its incredible importance for the rest of the world, they transmit elsewhere.
Well, one of the transmission mechanisms is the dollar, and I wanted to talk about the dollar next, because the dollar is extraordinarily strong to the degree that advanced economies are intervening. I wondered whether you thought that intervention made sense.
When we look at the dollar, we have to recognize it is strong for an objective reason. The US economy is strong and interest rates are high. How that impacts other economies, of course, it leads to the devaluation of other currencies, and it makes it harder for countries to cope with the pressures on their own economies. Let's first look into how serious a problem it is. And actually, if you take trade-adjusted dollar, it is not that dramatic of a problem. In fact, vis-a-vis the peak in October 2022, when the dollar in interest rates jumped and the dollar jumped, it is now 5% cheaper. But when we look at parts of the world, like Asia, where interest rates are lower and have remained lower, this is creating a lot of pressure. And we see, for example, Indonesia increase their interest rate in response to the strong dollar. Obviously, if an economy finds itself in a very difficult spot and there is risk to financial stability, they have to reflect on these risks.
But what about Japan? Because Japan is not in that category. You are presumably giving advice to the Japanese. Do you think they're doing the right thing with their interventions?
Well, first, we don't comment on countries' forex actions. But let's say two things about Japan. The first one is that in Japan, the drop of the yen is really dramatic. 35% since the beginning of interest rates increase in the US. 10% since the beginning of the year. Second, Japan, as a matter of principle, is committed to flexible exchange rate. So if Japan was to ever do anything, it would be in a context of assessing that there could be a risk to financial stability. And yes, we do engage with Japan. In fact, we sit in this room. Our board today would discuss the Article 4 for Japan, and there would be a lot of details on that question.
Interesting. Okay, well, I won't expect you to tell us what you're going to discuss there. But one other aspect of the dollar is that what you, in the past, when you've seen a very strong dollar and high rates, you have seen cascading crises in many emerging economies. And one of the striking things this time around is that we haven't seen that. Why is that?
Well, because different parts of the world have gone through very dramatic shocks in the past. We had in Latin America, the 80s, we had the East Asia crisis in the 90s, we had the global financial crisis, and all of these crises led to countries build strong fundamentals, strong fiscal policy, strong monetary policy. When you look at the inflation shock that the world has experienced, it was emerging markets, Brazil, Mexico, that reacted to this first. They increased interest rates at the time when advanced economies leisurely were saying, oh, it is transitory, don't worry. And that strength of policies and institutions is what makes it now possible for emerging markets to withstand. They also built reserves. Many of them have gone wisely into precautionary arrangements with the fund. So we back them up at the time of shock. Their economies can withstand it. And you see this difference in the world. You still have some economies where they haven't taken the necessary actions, and they are, of course, much more vulnerable today.
But it is one of the striking shifts in the world economy that now you have so much more resilience in so many emerging markets that they can withstand this quite dramatic shift in global rates.
When you look at it, today there is $11 trillion in reserves in central banks. a big chunk of it is in emerging markets. And that is the lesson they drew from past crises. Be prepared, anticipate shocks, they are going to come. Make yourself stronger so you can withstand them.
As we continue our little whistle-stop tour, let's stop off in China, where you and I both were a month ago. I have to say, I left China very gloomy about, not about the immediate short term, but about the medium term, and about the wisdom of the strategy of what's it called, new productive forces that President Xi is on. Do you think that China is dealing with its debt deflation problem in the right way, and does this focus on advanced manufacturing make sense?
Well, China is facing a fork on the road. Their population is aging. The model they have applied successfully in the past of massively exporting in a more fragmented world is not going to work anymore. And their economic team is still absorbing that change in the world in which they have to place China. We have been advising China to do three things. One, open up more space for market forces. Do not privilege state-owned enterprises, because then you have this dislocation of capital, and that affects your growth. Two, deal with the problem of real estate more forcefully. Make it so that it really disappears. Right now, it has eased, but it's still there. And that is very bad, because the Chinese people think of their property as their pension, their saving. And when property values go down, guess what happens? They don't spend because they worry about their future. And that is the third leg of our advice. Seriously orient the economy towards domestic consumption. And that means create confidence in people so they don't have to to save so much and spend so little. And confidence is a hard thing to gain.
But they're not really following that advice, right?
Well, they have adopted, so let's start from the positive. They have adopted a dual circulation strategy. That means we need to pay more attention to the domestic market and how we create confidence domestically. What they find is it is hard to switch from the known to the unknown. And we will continue, as you could be sure we would continue to engage with China to promote the right set of policies, because China matters not only for 1.4 billion Chinese, it matters for Asia, it matters for the world.
I mean, one of the reasons for this, as you said, is the fragmentation of the world, with the Sino-US tensions as being sort of one part of it. You at the fund have done a huge amount of work on the costs of deglobalization of a fragmenting world. And I think you had a number that there were 2,500 new interventions last year. I mean, you've documented this better than anybody else. But I wanted to ask you whether, not just what you think the costs of this are, but whether we are really unraveling a system that we have built up since the Second World War of a rules-based international economy, whereas now it's kind of a zero-sum world, each for their own, no one adopts it. And what will the cost of that be? Are we like Roadrunner, you know, we've gone off the cliff and we haven't yet realized that it's all falling apart?
So there is good news, there is bad news. Which one do you want first?
Let's go with the good news first.
The good news is that the world is not disintegrating. In fact, all these measures have shifted trade to go around obstacles rather than cut it. We now have the so-called connector countries, where trade that would have gone from A to B directly now goes A, B, C, and sometimes D. It increases costs, but it also shows the wisdom we have that when we trade, we thrive. Bad news?
Go for it.
Okay. Bad news is that we seem to have forgotten that industrial policy, by and large, leads to misallocation of capital. And we now have a huge enthusiasm about industrial policy everywhere. 2,500 industrial policy measures. Half of them come from 3 places: China, US, Europe. And when we look at justification on the basis of market failure, because remember, industrial policy is good when it removes a market failure, we could credibly prove for 1/3 of them, there is a reason, there is a market failure. 2/3, no really justifiable reason. And what we know from experience is that when you take a step, there is reciprocity. 75% probability that if one country introduces a restrictive measure, the country against this measure is directed would reciprocate. So we are on this slippery slope. What is the cost? We are measuring that just trade restrictions can cause the world economy to lose between 0.2% and 7% of GDP. It is like we take Japan and Germany, we wipe them out from the world economy, and we live with the rest. So it is really costly. And as I said, I go back to my good news. It looks like, actually, despite all the efforts to genuinely fragment the world significantly, there is resistance from the common sense of businesses and countries.
But if
I want to ask the audience, how many of you belong to the common sense?
No one's put their hand up. That's good.
Trade and thrive. How many of you believe
Actually,
that
let's put it a
trade
different
is
way.
good?
How many people think that industrial policy is a bad idea? There's actually very, very few hands going up. Okay, so
how many of you think it is a good idea? Because there is also people sitting on the bench.
Yeah, no, I think they're just shy.
Good idea.
We also can't see very well, but this is a really big deal, because I think we at The Economist, and perhaps you at we're the only free traders left around here, because everybody thinks that even if they don't believe in industrial policy, they say, as you say, well, the US has got the IRA, we in Europe need to do something else. And there is so I worry about how you get out of this dynamic.
Let me say very seriously that some of this is justified. What we learned from the pandemic and from Russia's invasion is that security of supplies has to be taken seriously, and that means some costs of protecting that security of supplies are justified. What we are arguing is that there is a very long way between 0.2% cost and 7% cost. So let's apply wisdom, protect security of supplies without distorting so much the economy that we are all poorer and less secure.
And unfortunately, we do seem to be on the path of going from the 0.2 towards the 7.
Well, I'm an eternal optimist. I actually think that policymakers do take course correction when they see that where they're headed is, falling off a cliff. So
well, that's quite a late time to do it. I wanted to end by asking you to elaborate a bit. In a recent speech, you said that there were 3 possible scenarios for the 20s, for this decade. They could be the turbulent 20s, the tepid 20s, or the transformational 20s. Now, it's pretty clear from your description which of those is the best one. But just give us a brief sense of which you think is the most, characterize them briefly, and then which you think is the most likely.
Okay. Turbulent 20s, we started with all these shocks. Tepid 20s, this is where we are headed on inertia right now. We project growth for the rest of the decade to be relatively weak, around 3%. This is way below where it was before the pandemic. We had average growth of 3.8%. Transformational, we ride on technological advancements, on the green transition, on AI, and we transform our societies to be more productive. We enhance growth, and we also share the benefits of growth more fairly, so we do not have people on the street as we had just before the pandemic. These are the 3 options. Where we are going to land? I actually think that we would have all of those in different parts of the world different manifestation, because one of the most troubling developments in the last years is divergence in the world. Within advanced economies, US is doing very well, the Eurozone is not. Within emerging markets, strong fundamentals do well. The so-called connected countries, countries that love everybody, they trade with everybody, like Indonesia, Vietnam, they're doing well. And then we have low-income countries that are really in terrible shape, falling behind. So very likely, we would have a world in which some economies transform, some economies stagnate, and some parts of the world are in perpetual turbulence. Can we muster the will to work together to get all of us benefit from what we have? Tremendous advancement of technology and abundant capital, including human capital.
Well, that is a challenge for this group and for the next few days, to ensure that the 20s become the transformational 20s. Kristalina Georgieva, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I count on you.